We're actually going to start the webinar in approximately 3 minutes. We'll just allow some time for people to enter and get settled. And while we're arriving, I'd like to invite you to begin by introducing yourself. And I'd like to invite you to do that by using the Zoom chat function in the Zoom menu. So if you look in the chat box now, my colleague Ravenna will put 3 questions in there for you to answer. 3 questions are, what's your name? What's the city you're currently in? And what's one question about working in crisis that you're arriving with? So 3 things: your name, the city that you're in, and one question about working in crisis that you're arriving with. I'll just give you a minute to start responding to that. So we have Kim arriving, Magnus, we have Christian here. I'm not sure where you're from yet or what your question is, but I can see you're here. We have Barcelona, Spain. We have Dan from Japan. We also have Sienna here from the Wadawurrung land in Ocean Grove. Madrid. We have a question about how do we help others sit in this place of uncertainty and unknowing. Some of the other questions are about working with groups and great differences in power and worldviews. We've got Cheryl from Vermont in the US. We have Christian again in Copenhagen. Question is about how to align culture and strategy. Kim is based in Auckland. We also have Gerarda in Brisbane. Welcome. How to respond to aggressive behaviors that are grounded in fear. Malaga, Spain. Franz joins us here, who's looking forward to learning from the experiences of the team. We have Miriam from Rome, whose question is about how to better use facilitation to help society recreate herself. Mishi from Tokyo. We have Magnus from Denmark as well. We have Johannesburg. How do we, questions here, Sofia, Bulgaria. There's Anna is calling in. One of the questions is how we help people in crisis move from coping to co-creating. So quite a few coming through right now. Welcome you for that. There's more coming through. Milan, Italy, wondering how we can support and accompany people in this difficult moment. So thank you for putting these in. There's too many to go through, but I'm really interested by the range of questions that you have and the places that you're located around the world. So thank you for being here. We might get started now, I think, given that we're moving in. What we'll do, just before we start, we will turn off the chat for now, and we'll reopen the chat towards the end of the session. You'll note that in your menu, there's a Q&A button, and that's the button that we'll be using predominantly as we go through the bulk of the webinar today, and that's where you'll be able to put in your questions to our panelists. So thank you everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all from us at Rios Partners. It's really exciting to be here today, and we look forward to this conversation on collaborating for transformation in times of crisis. So I haven't said who I am yet. My name's Steve Atkinson. I'm a member of the Rios Global Council and also a director of Rios Australia, and I'm joining you today from my hometown in Melbourne. So my role in this webinar today will be your host. I'm also joined by 3 Rios colleagues who I might ask to turn on their screen as well. We have Ravenna Naomi Barker, who's in Geneva right now. Thanks, Ravenna. She's been doing a lot of organising. We have Toa Mays in Amsterdam, and Toas will be helping sort questions as we go through the day. We can't see, can we see you, Toa? Yes, we can. And also Russell Fisher from Melbourne, who'll be supporting the workshop today in the background, or the webinar. So thanks to the team. So we will be working as a team in the webinar. And so from time to time, you'll see that I'll be toggling between Zoom, my notes, some of the chat that's coming through, Q&A sections. So if I appear to be looking away from the screen from time to time, I want you to know I'm not actually reading comic books, but I'm fully present and working with my colleagues to make this a successful session for you all. Just so that you're aware, also, we're recording this webinar and we'll share that with you later. Okay, so across the world right now, it seems to us at Rios that we're in quite a decisive decade. We're immersed in crises, in a whole range of issues from geopolitics, health, climate, race, that none of us can resolve alone, nor can we do so with our own organisation, even if we want to. And the year 2020, I guess, gave Rios further inspiration for investing heavily in how we start to work more systemically and more innovatively across some of these challenges. And we're exploring how to collaborate in new ways for greater impact. So to offer you some of our learnings about collaborating for impact, we've launched these series of webinars, the first of which is today. And we're bringing together our colleagues and partners to share some of their learnings in recent and current initiatives. So it doesn't end here. After this webinar, we'd also encourage you to bring your own challenges to us at Rios so we can explore together what might be possible in your own contexts. For those of you that don't know Rios well, Rios Partners is an international social enterprise that helps people move forward together on their most important and their most intractable challenges. So what this means is we spend a lot of time designing, facilitating, and guiding multi-stakeholder events, processes, multi-year platforms, and we work with teams, organizations, across sectors, with nations, and at times across multi-nations in regions. So we operate globally and also locally. We have offices in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Geneva, Johannesburg, London, Melbourne, Montreal, and Sao Paulo. And we work on a whole range of challenges from economic inclusion, education, energy and climate, health and equity, natural resources, land, food, peace, governance, democracy, etc. And what's really exciting about working in Rios, at least for me, is that our work is constantly being tested and challenged. We're constantly learning. We're learning about what kinds of change and systemic impact collaboration can create. We're learning how to collaborate. We're learning how to innovate better. And I find that we're generally open to different ways of experimenting and improving what we do. So in the two webinars that we're hosting this week, we've invited a few of our partners to reflect on some of the biggest learnings from 2020. This particular webinar that we're at now has three components. So firstly, and I'll do this in a moment, is provide you with a very brief overview of our key learnings that were captured in our 2020 learning report. You may have read this or seen parts of that already. We'll then spend the bulk of our time together hearing from three of our partners about the experiences that led to these learnings and about what these learnings have meant to them in practice. That's the bit I'm looking forward to. And then we'll have time for the Q&A before we wrap up. So as you listen to today's speakers, again, I invite you to type your questions into the Q&A section of Zoom. And in doing this, there's two things. Please type in both your question and also the name of the panelist that the question is addressed to. So without further ado, let's get started. I'd like to introduce you to our partners and collaborators who are joining us today. So panelists, I'd invite you now to turn on your video and wave to our audience as I introduce you by name. So first of all, let me introduce Rana Milham. Rana has extensive background working in the humanitarian and development space. Rana currently leads the justice and transformation work in the Middle East and North African region with the Hague Institute for Innovation in Law, which we affectionately know as HIL within RIOS. HIL's based in the Netherlands. And RIOS Partners has been working with Rana and her team at HIL on the Syria Justice Innovation Process, which aims to deliver people-centered justice for the people of Syria. So today, Rana joins us from Beirut, Lebanon. Thanks so much, Rana, for joining us today. We welcome you here. The second panelist we have today is Mendy Mirabindi. Mendy's is the Managing Director of Liaison Rwanda, which is an independent, non-banking financial organization which supports its clients in building and maintaining risk management and internal control structures. Mendy's has been a participant in the Inclusive Insurance Innovation Lab, which RIOS delivers. And RIOS delivers that in partnership with GIZ, which is a German federal enterprise that supports the German government in achieving its international sustainable development objectives. Also the Access to Insurance Initiative and the Global Leadership Academy. So Mendy's joins us today from Kigali, Rwanda. Thank you very much, Mendy's, for being here with us. And finally, I'd like to introduce our third panelist, Caitlin Sampson. Caitlin's a Senior Project Officer at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, or the AIDR. The Institute develops, maintains and shares knowledge and learning to support a disaster resilient Australia. So the Institute works with government, communities, NGOs, research organisations, education partners, and also the private sector to enhance disaster resilience through innovative thinking, professional development and knowledge sharing. Caitlin's a member of the Scenario team in a project called Preparing Emergency Services for Operations in a Climate Challenged World. That project is led by RIOS Partners, RMIT University, and the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre. Caitlin joins us today from Melbourne, Australia. Welcome, Caitlin, and thank you also for being here. So just before we invite our panelists to speak, I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of the RIOS 2020 Learning Report, which was the inspiration and really, I guess, the starting point for today's conversation. So let me share my screen with you briefly and walk you through just a few slides here. So 2020, what a year that's been for us. There's no doubt that that particular year will be remembered in history as a year of great disruption and crisis. The overlapping crises from the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had climate change, racial inequity, weaknesses showing up in democracy, geopolitical tensions and humanitarian emergencies. They've all touched probably almost everybody on the planet and are continuing to do so. So the future, as it stands, remains uncertain as we see it. In our review of 2020, through these compounding crises, we've shared 5 learnings really on how to collaborate in order to transform crises. Now, the learnings that we've shared in our webinar series have been drawn not only from the 5 projects that we featured in this report, 3 of which we'll begin to explore today, but across 130 different RIOS projects from across 33 different countries. So the 5 learnings that we've captured here, I'll just refer to those briefly before we move on. Learning 1 is imagining what's possible enables more effective crisis response. The second learning is that working systemically reveals strategic opportunities in a crisis. The third learning is that relationships across a system help enable timely response to crises. Number 4 is that working towards decolonization supports resilience. And then finally, working experimentally can reduce the devastation of future crises. So let me pause there for a sec. And I suppose what we've done is we've asked each of our panelists to help us better understand the learnings that are featured in this report. So to our panelists, I'd like to invite each of you to briefly share with us a bit about the project that you're working on with RIOS and how the story of that project starts to illustrate some of these learnings. And I'd also like to remind all of you in attendance that we do welcome your questions throughout the presentations. And please remember when you're typing those in to type in the question itself and the name of the panelist that the question is addressed to in the Q&A section of Zoom. And while that's happening, our team will gather those questions and the panelists will respond to as many of them as we can during the Q&A period. So Rana, let's start with you. I'd like to invite you to share your experience on the Syria Justice Innovation process. So I'm going to turn my video off and hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Let me first tell the story of Syria Justice Innovation Process, SJIP for short. SJIP was born as a result of a series of dialogues which were conducted between Syrian stakeholders to identify and solve the most pressing legal needs which Syrians face on a daily basis. In other words, they got together to facilitate for Syrians to access user-friendly justice. The stakeholder members come from different backgrounds, geographical areas in Syria, political affiliations, and expertise. You will see among them the lawyer, the judge, the entrepreneur, university professor, civil society activist, among others. So they simply make a beautiful, diverse mix. So despite their differences and the very challenging context they come from, the stakeholder member unified their voice and identified 6 justice goals, which they aim to work towards its achievement. These justice goals in brief are reducing violence against women, children protection, access to documentation, access to housing and land and property rights, access to public services, and gender protection. So basically, they agreed to work towards achieving these goals through running justice innovation labs. So they wanted to be different, wanted to be innovative in the way they address the legal problems. WeHill, in collaboration with RIOS partners, supported them in that and provided them with a safe container to have these dialogues, invent and develop solutions to address justice needs in Syria. So if you look at SJIP and the context it's working in, you realize they are already operating in a very challenging context, but that was not it. As you mentioned, Steve, in 2020, COVID-19 hit, and so achieving these goals have been impacted. We needed, together with the stakeholder team, to unpack the impact by the crisis in each goal. COVID-19 pandemics put the world, as you all know, on pause. Many sectors were affected in every part of the world, not only in Syria. The justice sector in particular was one of those which were severely affected. So here where I would like to underline the main learning we gained. We learned through this process to look at the whole system and to try to identify opportunity areas emerging from the crisis, which could be leveraged to overcome some of the negative impacts on achieving these goals. So we asked ourselves, what has changed in a positive way? We stated the obvious: technology, the space which the internet provided, was an opportunity the stakeholder wanted to seize. For example, the crisis exacerbated violence against women and girls. Some women were trapped during the lockdown in their homes, which were supposed to be safe. but unfortunately they were not. So how can those women be reached in their homes? A bird's eye view helped to look at the system as a whole, the crisis as a whole, to reveal opportunities that would support women in need of help. So in response to that, a chatbot was developed to reach women without the need for them to leave their homes. And so they can access services and know about the rights and what they could do in situations where they need help. And of course, there are more examples to give where, like, you know, stakeholder members thought of addressing of these goals and finding solutions amidst this crisis. But I chose to highlight this one in specific for the limitation of time. And as I'm concluding, I would like also to share that through the process, we also learned to explore possible future together, enable more effective crisis response. Meaning working together is important, bringing stakeholders together to brainstorm, to think and strategize and implement was very important and effective in the process. Another learning is working experimentally can reduce the devastation of future crises. That was demonstrated by the Justice Innovation Labs through verifying assumptions, learning more, and test and experiment ideas to reduce the impact of crisis on legal issues. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks so much, Ron. I appreciate that greatly. And it's just an extraordinary situation that you're in right there. I've had some conversations with our RIOS colleagues about this project, and what strikes me is that not only is it the multiplicity of complex challenges that you're facing, but just the nature of some of that trauma that exists in those challenges. You're dealing with violence against women, children's protection issues, big legal issues, health issues, all at the same time. And it's an extraordinarily difficult time. So thank you for sharing. And I'd like to now hand over to Mendes, and she'll talk to us about the Inclusive Insurance Innovation Lab. Thank you, Mendes.
Thank you, Steve. Just as a background for the Insurance Lab, Rwanda has an adult population of about 7.1 million, with about 74% residing in the rural areas, and only 17% of that adult population has access to insurance. So it was imperative that we build an environment to enable the vulnerable societies to be able to access insurance and to access insurance products that actually serve a need. So that is when we joined the Insurance Innovation Lab. So the Insurance Innovation Lab is meant to develop an inclusive insurance market. And this is supposed to be done through collaboration and participation of various stakeholders. And from these stakeholders, we intend to dialogue, to actively listen, and find solutions to enable an inclusive market. So when the process was supposed to start, COVID hit. Economies started to shut down. There was an entire lockdown. We could not move to offices. We could not travel. The lab process itself has 4 countries involved: Rwanda, Argentina, Morocco, and India. And within the Rwanda lab team, we had stakeholders from various institutions. We had the Ministry of Finance, the National Bank of Rwanda, who is the insurance regulator. We had the intermediaries. We had the mobile network organizations, market facilitators such as Access to Finance, whose main role is to have an environment where there's inclusive financial inclusion for all. And then we had the consumers, the consumer groups. So we needed to bring all these people to find a workable solution. Now, with the lockdowns, with COVID, we could not communicate face-to-face. We could not meet face-to-face. The whole idea was that we would travel to the other countries, get a feel of what is happening in the other countries hands-on, and also build trust amongst the stakeholders, get feedback from each other, listen to each other, and come up with a workable solution on how to move forward as an industry. And now, with the lockdowns, we are thinking, we've always been taught that to build trust, to build relationships, you need to meet physically, you need to have face-to-face communication. Now we thought the lab was going to collapse. Then with the help of Rio's partners, we were told everything would be handled online. So the process went online. We were wondering how we would engage one-on-one, also with the other countries, also with the relevant stakeholders within Rwanda. We had never met, some of us had never met, and it was going to be the first time meeting. And if everything was going to be held online, how successful would it be? Would we be able to actually discuss and actually have trust amongst each other? And fortunately, some of us had the mindset, we came from primary schools where we didn't have computers. We had high schools where you only found a computer in the computer lab. You also went to university where the only access to a computer was in a computer lab. So it was difficult to imagine everything being taken online. And fortunately, it worked out online. We were put in groups, we were paired, we would discuss, but within the process, when people were entering the process, each person came with their own assumptions. If we looked from the point of view of the regulator, they were saying the insurers are bringing products that are not really meeting needs. They are not educating the public on their products. The consumers were saying the products that are out there don't even meet our needs. Insurance is for the rich. We don't trust insurance companies. They don't pay claims. From the intermediaries such as myself, a broker, I was saying our role was being undermined. You insurers are taking us as competitors, and yet we are the ones who deal directly with the client. Our voice is not being heard in the market. When regulations are being put out there, we are not being asked to participate. And then the market facilitators were saying, we have done a lot of research, we've got data, we've got a lot of information that you insurers can use, but you're not using it, and that is why we are having this problem. The MNOs were saying, we've got the technology platform, you're not even using our platforms to sell your products. So a lot of people were coming with different views, a lack of trust. Insurers were saying, we have the products meet the needs, but you are not technical. So in coming up with the lab, we were able to discuss and reach a common ground. And out of that lab process, we realized that one thing that was coming out was that we were not talking to each other. We were not educating the public. We were not listening to the public. And so what we then decided as a group, with the voices from all the participants, we then decided to, as an industry, that we were going to educate. And we wanted to use a platform that would reach everyone, that would be exciting, that would be involving, that would be fun, where we not only educate, but we also listen from the public. So we then we developed a prototype, and that prototype was educating through the media. So we started with our prototype, which was a community radio setup, where through the community radio, we had a 2-part show where we were educating, telling about insurance, the structure of the insurance, the products available, how to make a claim. And then we also had a community competition where people call in, and we also put this out on social media. We also had interviews with consumers. There was no face-to-face interaction, no physical contact, but we used the relevant online platforms. We used the phones, we talked to people on the phones, and out of that, we have received a lot of feedback. And going forward, we are hoping that we'll have annual events. We're going to have a permanent committee that ensures that we always have, we're always listening, we're always engaging each other, and we're able to provide products that have come from the public, from the voice of the public. And as stakeholders, we have developed a platform that allows continuous interaction, continuous dialogue, and thus we are able to move forward. So the entire process has taught us as a nation that when we dialogue, when we continue to interact, when we continue to speak in one voice, we are able to move forward. And no matter what is thrown at us, even with COVID, the nation continues to stand and we continue to move on. As individual organizations and as individuals who has learned that to think out of the box, to not have the same mindset, but to keep moving even in times of crisis. So we are always thinking ahead. There are so many platforms that allow us to move. And this process for me has been experimenting. It's been a way to move forward. We have managed to bring people together and end up with one voice and with one, and in the mind of meeting the needs of people. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And indeed, it has been a learning event for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandis. And I think hearing you talk now, we could probably spend 2 days on this case example. There's many lessons coming out of this. I guess I'm touched by the courage and resilience of this group, this huge, diverse, multi-sector group, multi-stakeholder group, to work through some of these really complex issues, particularly with COVID. I guess we've all felt the challenge of having that limitation of not being able to travel, but particularly in those dire circumstances, the way that you've been able to, or the teams have been able to innovate and think differently and continue that process despite that is quite inspiring. So once again, thank you. And I look very much forward to the questions that will emerge. So to our participants again, please remember to put those Q&A questions in that you have, with also the name of the panelist to whom the question is addressed. So thank you for that. And finally, I'd like to ask Caitlin Sampson to share with us what she's been experiencing and learning from the Scenario project that you're a member of, Caitlin, which is preparing emergency services for operations in a climate challenged world, which again encompasses both Australia and New Zealand. Thanks, Caitlin.
Oh, thanks so much, Steve. And thanks so much for inviting me to speak on our Climate Scenarios project today. I'd just like to note as well that it's been really wonderful to gain insight into the range of these really important projects that RIOS is working on in different parts of the world. It's really inspiring and amazing to hear, and congratulations to everyone involved. So as Steve really aptly described in his introduction, I work with the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. Our remit as an organisation is to enhance Australia's national capability for disaster risk reduction and resilience. And to do this, you know, we develop and broker knowledge, we build and support networks and critical relationships, and we drive thought leadership and best practice. And as you can imagine, we certainly don't do this in isolation. You know, that would be impossible, and it sort of taps into the remit of the work that RIOS is also doing. You know, we work with stakeholders from all levels of government, with the private sector, with civil society, with education and research institutes, and everyone else in between. But particularly in this space, the emergency management and the emergency services sector, it plays a really key role in the disaster risk reduction space, and particularly when we bring together, you know, climate change and disaster risk, which is a cross-cutting theme in all of the work that we do, and of course an increasingly important theme in all of the work that we do. So one of my responsibilities in this space is to bring together the key stakeholders from our jurisdictional emergency services agencies, in addition to some of Australia's leading climate scientists and researchers, to address and also to influence how the sector is preparing for and managing the risks associated with climate change. You know, just to give you a quick snapshot, here in Australia, we know that climate change is increasing the frequency, increasing the intensity, and also the complexity of a range of extreme weather and natural hazard events. And just to give you an overview of some of these, you know, we're experiencing more frequent and intense extreme heat events all throughout Australia. We're experiencing more dangerous bushfire conditions. Some of you might recall that we recently lived through an extreme season of bushfires that we refer to as the Black Summer. Our bushfire seasons are also starting earlier and finishing later, so there's a whole range of implications associated with that. We're experiencing more extreme rainfall and flooding, sea level rise and storm surge, you know, thunderstorms, and also our cyclones, particularly in the north of Australia, you know, are becoming more intense. So in this context, our emergency services agencies need to be able to plan for a range of possible future climate scenarios to ensure that we really are as prepared as possible to respond to the influence of climate change on these extreme weather events. In terms of what we need from our emergency services, we need for them to be innovative, to think of new ways of dealing with these, you know, bushfires, floods, cyclones and heat waves, and to establish, or to be able to establish, new and better ways of sharing, managing and using resources. And we need our emergency services to start preparing now for these future risks and these possible climate scenarios. We also need our emergency services to be ready for the unexpected and to embrace uncertainty. So this is the context that we engaged our RIOS partners and our team of researchers from RMIT University, and we engaged them to take us through a process of imagining and developing a logical future, or a set of logical future plausible scenarios for how the future might unfold in an increasingly climate challenged world, and what this might mean for the strategic planning, the resourcing and the operations in the fire and emergency services sector. So we brought together a team of stakeholders from the emergency management and land management sector. And this team have met 4 or so times now to engage in a dynamic online workshop process. So this was online given, the COVID situation. The RIOS team have also interviewed a series of emergency management leaders to gain their insights and experiences to go deep into their thinking and what this means for this future scenario process. And in terms of my reflections and my learning, this has certainly been an illuminating and a mentally stretching process. And that's certainly a big ticket outcome, considering, we work in the space of knowledge and thought leadership and thinking. We're halfway through the process, so the lessons and the thinking that I'm sharing with you are certainly a work in process. In developing these scenarios. The people involved in this project have a wealth of subject matter expertise, but the team have really asked us to step out of our comfort zones, to think at the meta level, to think outside of our sectors, outside of our everyday working lives, to consider the big picture, to consider some of the key driving forces that will influence the emergency services in the future. And we've earmarked this future as 2035. So we're thinking of scenarios out to that point. We're being asked to be creative, to stretch our thinking to what the world might look like in these scenarios. And we're also being asked to imagine the story or the trajectory that got us to those, imagined future states. So this is certainly a work in progress, where I think we're about halfway through. There's certainly a lot of hard work to do and a lot of hard thinking to be done. And in terms of my reflections on what we're learning and what we have learned, I think this process has certainly reinforced for me, and I think the project team would also share these ideas. It's certainly reinforcing the value and power of collaborative thinking, of bringing a diverse range of people together who see the world often in very different ways. And there's a powerful driving force here to solve problems that, like climate change, and how we manage and plan and prepare for working in a climate challenged future. So for working to solve problems that really do exist in this realm of volatility, of uncertainty, complexity, and often with ambiguity. For me, this project and this process of scenario thinking and scenario planning is also really reinforcing the value of creative thinking, of imagining what's possible, and also valuing addressing issues at the systemic level rather than band-aid solutions to really complex problems. So we're putting a lot of trust in the process. We're putting a lot of trust in the RIOS team. Ultimately, we want to be able to deliver a set of plausible future scenarios to the leaders of our emergency services agencies, to our commissioners, who are really looking to us for advice and guidance. And we want to be able to deliver to them a methodology that they can then use for planning their operations in this increasingly climate challenged world. So thanks to the RIOS team. It's a fabulous initiative to be involved in. I'm really looking forward to the outcomes because this work will really springboard a whole range of other initiatives that we will be working on as well. So thanks so much.
So thanks very much, Caitlin, for sharing that. And I must admit to everyone on this call, I have some familiarity with this particular project, being part of it. I think what's interesting too is that, again, with COVID and with also recent bushfires in Australia that have been quite extreme and have also, even though they were rural bushfires, they led to hundreds of people with health problems in our capital city. So the flow-on effects and the interrelatedness and the impacts between these events are quite extraordinary and can compound in different ways. I'm really interested, I guess we'll find out as we go, but this whole experience of living through 2020 and COVID and its implications, plus these fires, I think will start to help some of the leaders in these areas just think again a bit further about what plausibility actually is. One of the key elements of this scenarios is, are they actually plausible? Could they happen? And, you know, if we'd said a month before COVID started that in a year from now, all of these things would have happened, I'm not sure whether people would have actually believed it. But now we've been through that, perhaps there's a new window to help leverage some of this work that we're doing in a new way. But so thank you again very much, Caitlin, for sharing that, and appreciate the thoughts, and look forward again to the questions that might be emerging for you in relation to that project. Okay, so let me now take us into the Q&A component. And so in the time remaining, let's now respond to the questions that you have. So we'll remind you once again, you can continue to put those questions in the Q&A section of Zoom if you need to. We certainly won't be able to answer all of those questions today, but we'll continue the conversation on social media in other ways following today. So right now I'll invite our panelists to turn their videos back on, and I'll start sharing some of the questions to our panelists that both Russell and Toa have been putting together. And we'll start in order of the panelist presentation. So the first question goes to Rana. So Rana, could you give us some examples of what emerged when you were verifying assumptions?
This is a really good question. So just to mention, like through innovation process, people arrive with lots of assumptions about the problem. They think they know a lot about the issue. And so what happens during the process and the research, which is normally a user-centric process where the lab members basically walk through the journey of the person who's affected by this problem, understand and learn from them. How do they perceive the problem? How do they see it? How do they deal with it, or they don't deal with it? So during this process, basically going through the journey, here where like they start verifying assumption. Some of them, like, you know, it's just assumption that they're not right, and some of them they could be right. So I'll give examples, and specifically I will take examples from the Violence Against Women Innovation Labs. So the participants or the lab members looked at the issue of child marriage, and so their assumption was mothers don't participate or have no say in the whole issue. So they're passive, they don't play an active role. That was their assumption. But when they walk through the journeys of different users, they realized that actually mothers play a big role in that, and they should be very much targeted into the response. And so one of the ideas, the innovative ideas that came out of that innovation lab, particularly targeting or looking into child marriage, is a board game where it was designed to target not only children or girls at risk of getting married at certain age, like, you know, underage, but also it involved the whole family, including the mothers, so who play a big role in deciding whether to let the daughters get married at early age. Other assumptions were related to the women that are aware of their rights, but they chose not to seek services, and actually that was not. There's a truth in it somehow, but also it was not entirely true. When they developed the chatbot, there were many women basically got in touch with the chatbot to seek services.
Great, thank you, Rana, for that. To Mendes now. The question for you, Mendes, is when there were constraints such as hardware access, how did you solve the issue to include constrained participants?
Thank you very much, Steve. In the beginning, it was a bit difficult. When we had the issue of COVID, most institutions were not prepared. So most participants had desktops, which they could not take home. So when we first
Oh, Mendes, we've lost you.
Sorry.
There we go. Thank you.
When we first began the process, we engaged all participants, the organizations which they worked in, and we managed to get laptops for every single participant. But we still had the challenge that we needed to engage with the actual consumers. The good thing about Rwanda is that over 80% of the population has access to mobile phones. The challenge would have been the data to be able to engage with us. So we actually created a budget for that. And in certain instances, we came together as lab members and contributed money and sent data to people that we wanted to interview. And in that way, we had a very smooth process. Here and there, we would have constraints where during a session, like what just happened here, the internet would be unstable and it would drop during the session. But we managed to say, participants, whenever we're coming for this process, can we have two networks, a backup, so that if one drops, the other one automatically picks. But members were willing to actually donate to see the process flow, because when you're coming into the lab, there was no budget for
Great, thanks, Mendes. And I guess that's collaboration in action right there. A question for Caitlin is, how to shift the focus from quick fix solutions, I guess reactions, to more systemic approaches in times of crisis?
Yes, thank you for that question. That's certainly a really difficult question to answer, and one that is highly political. You know, I think systems thinking and addressing, you know, what's at the core of these highly complex and challenging issues is really, you know, part of the solution. But I think, you know, planning, and certainly this scenario planning process that we're going through, thinking about things in their long-term strategic approach is really critical here. Trusting, you know, depending on the topic or the subject, trusting in the science and the evidence, and placing value on that sort of knowledge is really important. You know, having the right people in place, the right leaders in place to make those really difficult decisions is also a really important part of that equation. You know, but that raises a whole nother can of worms. You know, what does the right leader, the right people mean, and how do we get them? Is it a matter of electing the right people or cultivating the right people for those to make those difficult decisions? I think compassionate leadership, long-term strategic thinking is a really important part of kind of making those long-term strategic decisions that really address those the systemic nature of those problems. So a really tough question, but I think they're some of the ingredients that will help to shifting that focus.
Great, thank you. I'm just looking at our clock here. And thanks for that to Caitlin there and Mendes and also Rana. I think we've run out of time for another round of questions, although I have a list here. So what I'll do at this stage is I'd like to thank our panelists very much for sharing all your experience, your insight and your thinking, and also to our attendees for your interest and questions, and also the precious time you've spent to be here today. So from here, in continuing this conversation, keeping this alive, there's really three ways forward. Firstly, you can visit our Rios Partners website at riospartners.com to sign up for our newsletter, which has got current articles about what we're continuing to learn. It also has details of further events that we're hosting. Secondly, you can contact us on social media at Rios Partners and the hashtag Collaborate to Transform. And best of all, if you're thinking about addressing a complex challenge in your own context or a particular issue, and you'd like to know more about how Rios could support you in that, we'd be delighted to communicate with you personally and directly on those kind of questions. So please feel free to email and phone any of us directly at Rios. So my contact details, for example, are on the Rios website under People, as are the details of all of our team. So please go ahead with that if that makes sense for you. So I'll invite Ravenna to turn the chat function back on just now. And as a last exchange for all of you here, I'd like to invite you to share in the Zoom chat one feeling word that you have and one new insight or wondering perhaps that you're taking away from this webinar. So one feeling word and one new insight or wondering that you're taking away from the webinar. So I won't talk to those directly at this point, given our time, but I'll invite you to spend a minute or so personally noticing and reflecting on those comments as they scroll through. And while they're scrolling through as well, I'll invite our panelists once again to turn on their videos. And I'd like to ask you very briefly to share from your perspectives one final, very short insight that you're taking away from today as well, just with our attendees here. So we'll take the same order that we did the presentations in. So Rana, Mendes, then Caitlin. Thank you.
Well, the impact for me is in every crisis lies opportunity, for sure.
From this, we've learned it's always essential to think out of the box and to know that with new challenges emerges new opportunities, and dialogue is always important to move forward. Thank you.
I think the thing that's really shone through for me is regardless of the issue, you know, they're all complex, difficult issues. We can't address them in isolation. We need to look at the whole picture. So addressing things that are systemic nature is really important.
Wonderful. Thank you to our panelists. And I'm again seeing more of these comments coming through from our attendees as well. So there's very interesting to have a look at those. So thank you very much to all participating. So on behalf of the Rios team, we thank again our panelists for their insights and also their generosity of time and spirit of being in here. And also to everybody in the webinar as well. We're delighted and grateful that you've been able to take an hour out of your busy day to join us. And we genuinely look forward to hearing from you soon. So thank you again, and bye everybody for now.